Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for continuing to listen to the stories and supporting Valor Media. We're going to continue with Dr. George Carillet's stories with the focus on the conferences and specifically the man and Christian worldview.
Thank you, Michael. Some of you might just be discovering these stories. Some have been following them along. And I finished talking about some stories of the mission fields and the early years in Crimea, which were wild following the end of the Soviet Union. And lots of people didn't know who was in charge. And the oligarchs and the mafia folks said, okay, we'll be in charge. So if you're interested in that, take a look at some of the previous stories I told. Now we approach the early to middle years of my time in Crimea, maybe from 1995 to 2012, somewhere in there, as things were changing and they were getting better. But before it was all over, they got worse. But that's for another time. So I want to talk about the apologetic conferences, which turned out to be so important to our ministry. And really, there are a lot of lessons for those of you who are tuned in because you're interested in missions, or maybe you're missionaries yourself. Some things might surprise you because you think about how things should be done or how they should happen, especially coming from American culture. Well, the conferences were a surprise to me. I would like to say, yes, after sitting down with all the books on strategy and reading and praying and fasting, I came up with the idea, I want to reach the super educated people of the former Soviet Union who speak Russian. Sounds like a mission statement, right? But I just went to Crimea to teach Bible to students who are majoring in English and German as teachers and as translators. But I wasn't there long until the Lord guided me along another path. And it's not a statement of humility, a statement of fact that it really appears that God started these conferences that I'm going to talk to you about. Now, where to start? Well, of course, in the beginning, and the short form of that story that I told at another time, a longer form, is that I was teaching at Crimean American College, teaching English Bible, and there was a cholera epidemic, and all the schools, universities were closed except for Crimean American College. A psychiatrist's son, who was also studying psychiatry, or would be, was advised by his father to go over to that college where they're still having classes and sit in, see if they'll let you sit in on some of those American classes so that it can improve your English. So Taras said yes. And he asked, and he was directed to my class. And when the class was over, he said, this sounds a lot like psychology. I said, well, sometimes it's a little difficult to separate some things, the physical, the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, and so forth. And theology touches on psychology too. Now, what brought all that up? We were on Genesis chapter 3 and the fall of humanity in Adam and Eve. And when you parse that, dissect that, describe that, then it sounds like your story and my story. Again, I'm leaving it shorter for here, but you can use your imagination about the loss of innocence, the tendency to blame, not take responsibility, the loss of intimacy, the loss of companionship, and all these things that happened, which happened today. That's why I say it's your story and it's my story. And Christ is still the answer. So he told his father about this, and his father invited me to his home. And in that culture, it wasn't normal. We should have met someplace else, maybe someplace for coffee. But to be invited into his home was an exceptional step. And we discussed ideas, and he said, would you be interested in talking to a few other doctors? Sure. And as the conversation continued, I said, well, do you think you could get a number of doctors together for us to have maybe some kind of a meeting between your doctors and doctors from the States? And he was excited about that. As the story continues, and we start to recruit people for the planning, and people have connections to help us get into places to meet. There is a man who was an advisor, a sociologist who was an advisor and did polls and so forth for Gorbachev. And he was at another university, and he said he wanted to be a part of this. So, well, would you mind if we had a sociologist? To make a long story short, it just kept growing that way until finally we had a lot of people interested, and we had a committee on which Sergei Golovin and I were the only Christians initially. All the rest were professed atheists. So made it very interesting. And the theme was going to be Человек, or man, or humanity, and the Christian worldview. And I'm going to tell you something about its purpose. Then I want to read you some quotes. But this off-the-cuff event continued for twice a year for almost 15 years.
Wow.
I didn't do it. But once it got started, you might say I was stuck with it.
Yeah.
It was awesome because I could see where this could go if this wasn't just a one-time event. So I wrote a missions professor, Charles Tabor, in the US, and said, Dr. Tabor, what would you advise me to do or not do? And I said, and I'll always remember these words, I've got a tiger by the tail. I can blow it, it'll be a one-time event, or it can be the beginning of a series of events. And the Lord blessed it. And he, by the way, became one of the first speakers, and a few years later, one of the few repeat speakers. And his paper presentation was on Christian ideology. What is it? And it still is a marvelous piece of work today. Oh, what else shall I say about with those side stories? Maybe a little tidbits later. So I wrote in 1999 a purpose statement to try to attract people. And by the way, Michael, I'm sorry, but it looks like our focus isn't focusing too well on us. We look a little bit blurry, and but probably rather than interrupt it, we'll just go ahead and continue. Yeah, it's not you. It's I think this thing's not focusing. You know, we had trouble with it before.
Yeah.
So folks, technical difficulties, but I think I'll continue because who knows, probably I'll look a little bit better, a little blurry. So I wrote this in the year 2000 or 1999 to attract people in the year 2000 from the US and Russian-speaking countries. And this is what I wrote as a general statement. That's the wrong paper. Okay, speaking of technical difficulties, I have a few right up here too.
Because you're human.
So in 1999, then, this is what I wrote. International conferences on critical concerns from a Christian perspective are designed to promote Christianity as the ideology or worldview, to fill the vacuum left by the failure of communism, and thus to promote Christian morality and responsibility in all areas of life, including government, education, science, medicine, and society to begin with. So, Man in the Christian Worldview, subtitled Conferences on Critical Concerns from a Christian Perspective, was providing an international academic setting for presenting the Christian worldview to those who were just fresh out of the former Soviet Union officially, but whose minds were pretty much still there. And this was to be in the context of their profession. I had doctors say, well, you know, what do you have to tell me? I mean, medicine's all about science. It's not about ethics. Yeah, that's right. That's what he said. It's not about all these other things and morality and so forth. By the way, I asked him, I said, well, so would you approve of what happened during the Holocaust, where surgeries were performed on prisoners that today most people would say that was barbarian and not acceptable? But are you saying that for the whatever further science is acceptable? And he more or less said yes. So this was the ethical or lack of ethics world in which our conferences were born. And it was more easy to talk about morality and it being the glue that holds society together with the fall of communism than talk about some other things. And a lot of folks were attracted to that. And one of the philosophers who'd been a Marxist philosopher said, you know, our anthropological problem is really a moral issue.
That's interesting.
So, Crimean American College, Simferopol Medical University, and the Crimean branch of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences jointly organized these academic lectureships, colloquiums, symposiums, Christians and non-Christians from around the world to discuss matters of critical concern from the perspective of the impact of one's worldview. So we were comparing worldviews, both in light of the test of truth and their practical effects, with a particular attention to moral issues, which, as Marxist professor said, turned out to be foundational to our common socio-economic crisis. This program was directed against what they called the intelligentsia, that is, the highly educated, influential members of society, especially those of Russia and Ukraine. It was designed to encourage the examination of one's worldview. Most people, you know, it's like the fish in water. Water, I don't see water. That's because the fish is seeing through it. So they never looked at the worldview because they thought, well, we are scientific materialists. We don't believe in superstition. Well, that's another story officially. And what we believe is objective. What you believe is irrational. So that was the viewpoint. And so we wanted people to take a look at the worldview that they may not have paid attention to and see where it led them, how it influenced their justice system, their medical world, everything. The tone of our meetings was to be dialogical, not polemical, which is to say, we wanted to talk and understand each other, not fight each other, not try to beat each other. So I wrote, to be understood, we must first show that we understand. We provide a forum in which competing worldviews can be understood, examined, and hopefully provide some direction for participants and the people they influence to make the world a better place, step by step, person by person. We also encourage the development of personal and professional friendships. Now, I hope I have it written down here somewhere because there are projects, including like 5 books that came out of this, among other things. So that's a little bit about the backstory of the conferences and their purposes. But, you know, if you don't mind, I want to read one other thing to you. Somebody else that was on our board for a long time, Teaching Ministries International, and a professor at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in the Department of Philosophy and specializing in anthropology. He attended most of our conferences and symposiums. I'll explain in a moment. Conferences we had in the fall, symposiums we had in the spring. He wrote, in October 95, the first Man in the Christian Worldview Conference was held in Simferopol, Ukraine, at the Supreme Soviet Building, or the Supreme Council Building, under the guidance of a small organizing committee chaired by Dr. George Carillet, Vice President of International Affairs of Crimean American College. A vision for an academic conference of a unique kind materialized. The idea was to bring together people from differing worldviews to present papers and discuss a wide range of critical cultural issues with both global and local significance. The uniqueness of this conference was found in its approach to the issues confronting humanity, The conference was designed to focus on the various worldviews which gave rise to different solutions and to examine each worldview for its philosophical integrity and to consider the practical outcomes of each when consistently applied, and so forth. Christianity was intentionally put forward as a viable alternative worldview. The organizing committee has envisioned the conference contributing to a mutual understanding among its participants regarding the true nature of man and his world, and work toward meaningful solutions. Further on, Bruce says, after 10 years, so this is a collection of my papers from the first 10 years, it is evident that the conferences had done more than could have been envisioned at the first meeting, thanks to the, skipping on, instead of one conference each year, 2 conferences developed, encouraged by the success of the first one. But I should say that at the end of the first one, Bruce said, George, I don't think I'll be back. But that's another story that I'll not tell. But in those days, there was more chaos than order. For somebody used to being very orderly, I don't mean about people shouting and so forth. I'm just thinking how they thought, how they wrote their papers. The fall conference is the larger of the two, and papers are presented in different sections as well as plenary sections. That's where everybody's present. In the spring, the number of participants is intentionally much smaller, and the format is that of a roundtable. Papers are presented and ideas are examined for truthfulness and practicality. Papers from both conferences are published each year in an attractively bound volume, and so forth, so on, gives it conferences a wider dissemination. It is safe to say that no one attending the first conference had any idea of the far implications it would come to in the years to come. And Bruce was among those. I'll probably not have time at the end, but there are some quotes in here that tell about the effectiveness of the conferences and the changes of their thinking. But it's too bad I didn't go ahead and collect the next 5 years of papers and have some of the remarkable quotes, such as when the Marxist stood up and said, I have decided that the most important thing is to know God. So obviously he wasn't a Marxist anymore. So about the use of the terms, I looked up the dictionary and the definition for a symposium is a conference. But I'm making a difference between these two terms just for clarity's sake for when I talk about one and the other, because they take place, as Bruce wrote, a different venue. Our first one, 400 people attended, and is at the Supreme Soviet or Council building in Simferopol, what they call their Pentagon because of its shape, not because of the military. The fall would attract a lot of people, and we'd have a lot of people just in attendance, but we would not have a lot of time for discussion. And this is where I felt like we need a venue where there can be follow-up. We need a venue where the papers are not only discussed after they're presented, but they're discussed at lunch, they're discussed at breakfast, they're discussed at supper. And so we had a spring meeting, and I call this a symposium because there's more the idea for me with the word symposium that we all come together, we bring our academic papers together addressing one particular theme or sub-theme, and then we discuss that. So it's not as broad ranging as maybe our conferences might have been. These were held at what they called sanatoriums or rest houses. And some of these rest houses had been villas of the people of note in the former Soviet Union, even going back to the czars. Our first spring symposium was held at Levadia. Levadia is probably a term you're not familiar with, but some of you have heard the word Yalta, the Yalta Conference, 1945. That's where the big three met, Roosevelt, Khrushchev, and Stalin, to decide who gets what after the war is over. That was February, I believe, of 45. And where they met was a Tsar's palace, and it overlooked the port of Yalta. Most of the time, we just read about the Yalta Conference. Well, we had our first spring meeting in those royal facilities. Imagine that. And that was noteworthy. But we met at the round table. Papers were presented. Questions were asked. Comments were made. Like I said, then there would be discussions. Well, how are you going to do that? When almost all of those who spoke Russian did not speak English. So we had translators. At first, they were my students from the college. Then later, when they were graduates, they continued doing this for us. And so every table had a translator. Out of that came, I think, 5 publications between Bruce Little and 2 professors, one in philosophy, the other in what they called politology, combination of political science and sociology. And these then became textbooks in the university where we Christians never could have got anything in there because we couldn't do anything on their campus, except that because I was going to have these conferences and symposiums, I would have somebody go out to the universities. We had a lot of them in Simferopol, capital of Crimea, and say, hey, we got these professors. This guy's in mathematics. This guy's in medicine. This guy's in law. This guy's in philosophy. Would you like for them to talk about a certain theme in their area to your students? Initially, they were rather reticent. Some of them were afraid that, the visiting light might outshine theirs, and you know how that goes. But we got a lot of our Western professors, mostly from the US, but from the UK, one from South Africa, one from Holland, one from Germany, one from France. And so most of these were accepted into a number of universities, and we had, of course, the translators had to go with them, and so forth. Some students were encouraged in their faith because they said, I'm afraid to tell people that I'm a Christian. They remember this, the early days there after the fall of communism. And I'm considered, ignorant or superstitious. But you've encouraged me to express my faith. I don't have to be ashamed. I don't have to hide. And there's answers and there's reasons. And there are people of higher education in the US and Europe that are Christians. And being a Christian influences their discipline even. So that was a byproduct then. And we continued that for some 15 years. And it touched on a lot of students, touched some professors as well. At these sanitariums, these were rather rustic, most of them rather rustic by our standards. A lot of them had been sitting unused for a number of years since the fall of the czars and the changing in the government and so forth. And even back then, they were not up to what the Western standard would have been, what you'd expect. By the way, I was behind Stalin's desk in his dacha during one of my visits. We visited many of those places along the coast, trying to find one that could accommodate 50 people. We allowed up to 25 presenters and up to 25 visitors to watch. And some of those were from the media. We would have some kind of a tour, something that was of interest in the area. And in those early days, because of our connections, those who had connections, we got to do things that were quite unusual. While Sevastopol was an off limits place except a residence and the Russian military that was there, or the Soviet, because that was their Black Sea port, their warm water port. We got to go when it was forbidden. So we were in bus loads. One bus broke down. That's, part of the story, part of the charm. And then we get to a place called Chersones. I think it's 4th century BC, Greek place, and fascinating ruins. And then there's these like church or temple pillars. And some of these folks who were in science but had their new freedom out of the Soviet Union were hugging the pillars and talking about feeling the vibes. I guess I wasn't too good at feeling the vibes, but so fascinating. Another time, we got to go on a PT boat. We went up the coast one direction, down another direction and back. And, you know, we were civilians on this military PT boat because everything's about connections. All right, what else am I going to tell you about this? One of the problems with having people from the West come was you can't get there from here. So you had to fly from the US to someplace in Western Europe. Then by train or plane, you would fly to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. But in the early days, there were very few flights, sometimes no flights, and they were not dependable. And we asked our participants not to book any flights. Let us handle all the inland travel arrangements and don't book any flights. Well, there's some independent travelers who feel like they can always, you know, manage on their own, but most people weren't successful at that. Joe was. Just so I'm sure Joe wouldn't be offended, but I think I'll not use his last name just in case he listens to this. Because I don't really remember how it was. He decided to get that flight. So he flies in from Kiev to Simferopol, capital of Crimea. We're, you know, just north of Turkey. We're there in the Black Sea. And everybody else is coming by train. And we send people up to meet them with their ticket, to be their translators, to make sure they're safe on the train and this sort of thing. And then bring them back and then pick them up. And then they stay with families. And we hosted a number ourselves. And then the lectures, the symposium, a little bit of sightseeing in town. Joe was at the first symposium, conference in the fall. And he had a flight to catch to get to Kiev, to catch his flight to get to West Europe, to catch his flight to get to the US. You get it. So we go to the airport and we are told, sorry, they canceled that flight. Yeah, but there wasn't enough fuel. They didn't have money to buy fuel. I said, but I have this person, he's got a plane to catch. Is there another flight today? No. Well, there would have been, because those who didn't catch the first flight, they were getting on another plane. Of course, none of this business about notifying you, you know, you leaving your phone number, what does that mean? And but people who knew better, they were prepared. So I called Emily Timchenko, the head of the college, and told her the problem. And I says, I don't know what we're going to do. There's no way I can drive him up in town in time. And the, you know, an overnight train won't do and so forth. And she says, 1 minute. Now, everybody who did anything for anybody in the Soviet period or afterwards, they were building up, you might say, coupons, redeemable coupons. So you hear people say, okay, you owe me one, or we're even now. Okay, well, it was smart to keep building up these things that you could call in. And you don't want to call in, you know, if something's worth $100 and your coupon's worth $1,000, you don't want to, and there's no change. So you don't want to lose it. So you got to think twice about whether you use your connection. Well, Emily had connections in the KGB, which was their, like, I don't know, maybe like our FBI and CIA together. And she made a call to the Minister of Transportation. Where was the plane? The plane was on the tarmac. The props were turning or whatever they were. I'm waiting for a call back. And I hear this crackling on the big old two-way radio thing, you know, and American. Joke. Anyway, and I tell the person, I think that's for us. I think it's about us, you know. The guy looks like, you know, sits, and I had almost no Russian skills at all at that point. and improved a lot since then. But anyway, this confession time. So, but I understood what was going on. And guy points at us and says, yes, not me, not my wife, this guy, he needs to be on that plane. He have the tower call the plane back in. And they put up some stairs for him to get in. He gets in, he goes and he sits. Well, I wasn't going to tell these long stories, but they sure are fun. There's no place to sit. There are people sitting in the aisle. Yeah, you like that, huh? No seatbelts for the aisle. So Joe takes his bag and tries to find a place to sit, but Americana, Americans there, huh? American, how do they say it? Shoot, Americanettes. So they're saying the American. So they have him come forward. And there's something like a jump seat between the pilot and the co-pilot. So Joe gets to sit there all the way to Kiev. I don't know those days where there was a 2-hour flight. And so he had a story to tell. We also had a story to tell. Don't book any more flights unless you got an extra day to spare because you can't trust them. Now, I've heard stories in those early days about planes not being allowed to land in Simferopol or Kiev because they hadn't paid for the fuel. Now, that's blackmail, right? I mean, that's, and I believe those stories. So you know what they did? The co-pilot took up a collection. He explained to the people the situation, and they could go to another airport, presumably. Then people would have to find their way to get to that one, but that's presumably. But that one they owed a debt to. So they took up a collection. And they got enough then to satisfy the ground team, and they were allowed to land. Oh, there's so many stories I just forget about having thought about from those early days. And they are really unbelievable. Emily was right that I should have taken notes to write a book. So I'm just doing some off-the-cuff storytelling now, thanks to Michael and Sarah. Okay, the PBT boat, the airplanes, changed minds. That psychiatrist's son, I baptized him into Christ. Some other folks who became influential in apologetics, baptized them into Christ. There were those who declared faith in Christ, but I can't say they were baptized into Christ. And then there was a man who had been to our conferences, and it was some years, I don't know, 5 years after our conferences, that finally, under the influence of one of our translators, Ginia, yeah, there's lots of Ginias there, Ginia baptized him into Christ. So seeds were planted. They just took longer to bear fruit. When we closed down our conferences, they were doing well, but I felt like they really weren't accomplishing our purposes as well as they did in the earlier days. But in Odessa, another seaport in Ukraine, they took up the mantle and for a number of years had the conferences. Kursk in Russia, they too did the same thing. And I don't know if they still have them to this day, but until recently, they were having these kinds of conferences, men in the Christian worldview. Well, one of the benefits for our translators is that they became really specialized and really well-equipped translators by doing the English into Russian and the Russian into English papers at this high academic level. Well, I'm not sure about the time, but we might be getting close to saving those quotes for another time. What do you say?
It's possible.
Anybody keeping an idea before our 40 minutes on Zoom runs out?
Actually, you have a little bit more time now.
Okay. Well, I'll just read you a couple of the quotes. So I read you what Bruce wrote. The writings of Sergei Yonovsky, who was the co-founder with me. It was his idea, actually. And he wrote,
alive?
I would expect so, but I'm not sure. Felix, the former Marxist, I don't know, but I rather doubt it.
I'd be curious to see how everyone is from today from that time.
A number of them that were on our board are deceased now, some just recently. The idea of international symposia, which would discuss issues related to spiritual revival of people in society, was born in 1994 during a personal conversation with George Carillet in my home. Sharing my impressions about my trip to the USA in 1990, I mentioned that such a country was certainly not built by lazy people. As our conversation continued, George Carillet remarked that both England and the United States were developed by Christians, and to illustrate his thought better, he quoted from the Apostle Paul, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men." Or as we say in Russian, do it for the sake of conscience, at least, not fear. When we set off on this journey toward spiritual programs and comprehended the timeless truths of Christianity, we also began to change the world around us by injecting into it our thoughts, ideas, and actions. Thus, as an introduction to the second volume of the conference, Book of Reports says, the thing that we are least aware of is actually what affects and changes our environment the most. It is our worldview. Man in the Christian Worldview is the title that we have chosen for our now traditional international symposium and its annual publication. Addressing the concerns of medicine, science, religion, philosophy, ethics, and the protection of the environment, we sought to find solutions to the core moral problems that are foundational to the universal social and economic crisis of both East and West. And so he continues. This is a lady who was on our board that died just last year, PhD in philosophy. She especially taught art. And Bruce kept trying to, she got close to her family, and kept trying to explain that the artist's worldview influenced his art. But because of her Soviet training, she was sure that was not the case. There were explanations for everything except one's Christian worldview. The idea of international symposia, which would discuss issues related to the spiritual revival of people in society, was born in 1994 during a personal conversation. In one place. The International Symposia, Man of the Christian Worldview, have become a remarkable phenomenon in social life and culture, both of Ukraine and a wider community. The symposia welcomes speakers from Russia, Belarus, Great Britain, the Netherlands, USA, and other countries. This fact is evidence of the relevance and significance of the issues the conference speakers address. The symposia, which are celebrating its 10th anniversary, organized by Dr. George Carillet, a man of high moral standards, spacious mind, I'm not sure. Spacious makes me think about empty. But in broad academic and cultural interest. Every paper by George Carillet combines a focus on global human problems with an appeal to every individual, because can people make a difference? George Carillet thinks so. One of the hallmarks of Dr. Carillet's presentations is the abundance of moral challenges discussed, which sets the stage and content for the conference. Okay, moving along then to the next person. He's also deceased now. He was a nuclear physicist and later went on. He was against apologetics, to put it mildly. And though he was friends with Sergei Golovin, that I've mentioned, an outstanding apologist, only sometime later did he turn to Sergei and say, about that material that I rejected before. And so he had besides his science work, he had that ministry.
You never know.
When I became a Christian in 1994, so remember, he's a new Christian, I was seeking to be engaged in a church ministry. Since I am a theoretical physicist by trade, I began to lean towards an apologetics ministry, scientific apologetics at first. Now my apologetic activities have essentially become my second profession. One of the reasons that prompted me to pursue such a ministry was the information that reached the church in Kiev about the new international symposium, Man in the Christian Worldview, held in so forth, so on. I presented my first paper in 1997, so just 3 years of Christian. Since then, I speak at the symposium every year The presentation, involvement, and the discussions and the publications provided by the symposium have become one of the avenues of development for my and for many others apologetic ministry, owing to the brotherly support of G. Carillet. Dr. Carillet's presentations at every symposium and my personal interactions with him often assist me in choosing the foci of my papers, advancing my apologetics research, et cetera, et cetera. President of the Russian Physics Society from Moscow wrote about the symposium. A geologist wrote about it. A medical doctor who was a Christian wrote about it. I believe every person knows a feeling which we call a sense of home. It is usually characterized by the state of security, peace of mind, and being at ease. I believe everyone who came in contact with the welcoming and gracious atmosphere of the International Symposium and Christian Worldview could say that he belongs there. One of the significant results of 10-year symposium history is a climate of acceptance for both student and reputable professors, philosophers, theologians, and medical doctors, Christian apologists, and advocates of atheism feel at home. Yet it has been noted that our contemporaries from academia, as well as many Christians in the secular environment, do not always feel at ease even in the church. Here, everyone is on his own turf. So that was like, something we didn't intend, but it came out of our Christian character and nature and trying to make things not combative, but really to understand each other and move along. Well, then Dr. Volchenko, the medical doctor who vowed to remain an atheist to the end, but who, just in case, had his 2 adult boys baptized at a Catholic church, Orthodox church. Yeah, he writes, I have to confess right away that by upbringing, educated, conviction, I'm an atheist and evolutionist. I've even chaired for 9 years this symposium. It may sound strange. In such a context, we cannot overstate the role of so forth, so on. And Nikolenko, philosophy PhD from Odessa. Then finally, Felix Lazarev, the former Marxist professor of philosophy.
So how do you foster that environment between Christians themselves who might have differing views, and then those who don't profess to be Christians? And there could be a diverse range of who those people are, because different worldviews, and then even within the worldview, there could be someone who's more charitable or not, and so on. So in light of the experiences, how do you continue that today, especially with how divisive things are?
We had a few people on various, helped rather adamantly to certain positions. Maybe that's not the way to put it. They were more combative, but we didn't have anybody that was terrible that way. I would say in the States, you would think twice about inviting somebody that you know is likely to be combative. So we selected those from the West who came. They applied. We selected them. I say we vetted them. But it was just open to any of the academics from Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. So we didn't know who we were getting, and some of them were a little stronger than others in their position, whether they were fellow atheists. It wasn't just between Christianity and atheism. By focusing, so we had a sub-theme to every one of our conferences. So Man of the Christian Worldview was just the title that kind of summarized what we were doing. So I guess there's a table of contents in the back here. Russian goes from the back to the front on their table of context. our first one was called Christianity, Humanism, and Health. But you had to understand that humanism did not mean like Christians talking about materialistic humanism, but rather simply meant about being humane. So it's important to understand how people use their terms before you suddenly start tearing them down. We had somebody who, he wasn't combative, but he was quick to take issue. And so sometimes people would misunderstand each other, and it's simply about terminology. So this was our first one, Christianity, Humanism, and Health. And the point was that Christianity promotes humane treatment of one another and promotes good mental, physical, spiritual, and psychological health. Next one, matters of life and death in the context of a Christian worldview. Christianity's historical claim to truth as the foundation to its worldview. The myth of progress, a world without virtue. Christianity's legacy. One of them addressed the question, are there any norms? Conceptualizing the normal and deviant in medicine, science, and society. Worldview and lifestyle, word and deed. Family, education, and lifestyle, the way, truth, and the life. Vital values and ideals, replenishing moral capital. Global problems and personal responsibility, can individuals make a difference? Maintaining a moral and physical health in times of cultural change, moral and spiritual foundations. Freedom, responsibility in science, medicine, and society. Philosophical and theological reflections. We had one that had to do with the 6 great ideas, had to do with truth, beauty, and goodness. Had to do with the others, justice, liberty, this sort of thing. So the subjects provided a certain amount of focus.
Right.
And so that was one way. So making sure we didn't have anybody from the West that just wanted to come and show those commies up, or some people might think, that's why I said you needed to understand before you can be understood. Of course, there's several famous lines from Brother Francis
And paraphrase
about how we should
seek first to understand, then to be understood.
And so that what people had to subscribe to that goal. And also we told them we're not going to change people's minds just in one single paper.
Right.
Not likely anyway. But we may get it going, may get the change going, and that's what happened. At our very first conference that was held there in the Supreme Soviet building, Dr. John Patrick, medical doctor from Toronto, I believe, presented a paper on euthanasia. That was one of our themes, dealing with health.
And no, it wasn't the young, right? In Asia.
Wasn't what?
Sorry, that's a common apologetic. It wasn't the young in Asia, the youth in Asia.
No. So that got him to thinking. And this director or president of the university, Medical University, a prestigious one at that, he had presented a paper in favor of euthanasia. But he was really stumped by John's paper. He later said, do you have his paper in writing? Of course, we published the booklet of papers. And yes, we gave it to him. At the next meeting that was held at the Medical University, he said, I got the written paper. I read it, I thought about it, and read it and thought about it. Now I've changed my position.
Wow.
I really thought that euthanasia was the most merciful thing to do to somebody. And I didn't think about the possible abuses and other philosophical issues as well as medical issues. So I have changed my position. He said that in front of the Medical University.
Wow.
So
That's amazing.
and then, of course, it was over a period of time, but when Felix, the Marxist philosopher, said that, he'd come to the conclusion that the most important thing was to know God. That's remarkable. When we first met him, it was like, well, if there is a God, he's not knowable.
So it's good to rub shoulders then.
So over a period of time, with repeated meetings, and this was the openness then. So when some of them came back from the West more than once, relationships were built up. Some of them that didn't come back, they communicated for a while. One of the things that happened too is nationals, Ukrainians and Russians who were Christians, their faith was being informed and fed, and they were being strengthened seeing this kind of interchange. Because normally, if they were believers, they shouldn't say it because they'll be pilloried or embarrassed or whatever, because atheism ruled. And we have that happening from time to time in every culture, including in the US, that some things, some positions are on the outs, and then later they're on the ends. And some are in for a short period of time, like maybe currently, and then they're out. The bankruptcy is revealed. But over a period of time, those ideas which have more support and practical value are apt to continue. May not rule the day, but they're apt to survive whatever comes your way.
What ideas have you seen endure from that time till now, both good and bad?
What ideas have I seen
Endure till this
endure?
day? The ones that didn't fizzle out and had a long-term stay across the board from that time.
So you're talking about in the US or the world, or?
Yeah. I would say a little bit of international impact of ideas.
See, at one of the coastal venues, the media, we always had the media, they came uninvited, but welcomed, and I was be interviewed. And so during one of the interviews early on, I was asked, well, I understand that you want to change people's thinking about things. Do you really think that it's possible that things change and people change? And I'm thinking, I have to reply about this because surely with the fall of the Soviet Union, there's an example of how some ideas didn't endure.
Yeah.
And there's some Marxist ideas and Leninist ideas that did not endure. So I thought I have to be gentle about saying, well, right now, the fact that we're meeting together and talking about things that we could have talked about before shows that some ideas have changed and people have changed. But I don't remember now, but probably I went on to talk about how, people in my acquaintance in Ukraine have changed, people in my acquaintance in other parts of the world. So people's ideas may change contrary to what they grew up with because there's good reason to. And sometimes even when there's good reason, it's difficult for change to come about because socio-political family issues can make a difference. It's difficult to be your own thinker in many cultures. But in the US, we look at our own history going back to slavery and to the present, we see ideas that were dominant and then later as an embarrassment to us. We do, in my paper on the myth of progress, one of the things I was looking at is that how we think that everything old is not as valuable as anything new. Some people call that what? Chronological snobbery. And sometimes people think, well, the best ideas that survive are the liberal ones, not your conservative ideas. And I said, well, you just don't know about your own history then, because we go on back and say, who was it in favor of slavery? Who was it who supported Jim Crow period and so forth? And so we've been up and down, and labels have sometimes been more fluid, but ideas become ascendant and then they become difficult to change because if you're in the minority, not talking about race, but in thinking, then it's difficult. And it's going to take time. But in time, if there's wisdom behind what you're saying, you'll either win out or you may see the destruction of the society as you know it. Of course, Russia, Ukraine has seen that. Sometimes ideas are not understood the same way in different parts of the world. When I talked about democracy in Ukraine in those early years, it was like, no, guys, democracy doesn't just mean every person one vote. It's not just about voting. And matter of fact, the US, we don't have a pure democracy. We have a represented democracy, or a republic.
Okay, public.
And so it's misunderstanding sometimes, even within our own country. And we might be toying with some ideas now as a nation to maybe move more in a direction of some of the European countries, for example. People are often shaped by their pocketbooks, you might say. And in America and in the West, we give a lot of value to, how much money do you make? Yet everybody understands that that's not the real value of life. No matter how you pursue it, that will not bring you happiness. Of course, as some poor person said, yeah, but I think I could be a whole lot more happy if I had more money.
Yeah.
And of course, there can be a truth to that. But we all know plenty of people who have had more money than knew what to do with, and they committed suicide, or they made some terrible choices that put them in jail for the rest of their life. I think his name is Fujiyama. May not be saying that right. He wrote a book that dealt with trust. And the point is, we all have social capital. Politicians talk about how political capital, how much political capital does the president have that he can use? You don't want to waste it. Kind of like the story before about somebody owes you something. You don't want to give them a coupon worth $1,000 for $100 in return. So you use your capital. Social capital is really important, and it's built on trust. So there are some things that we may see wax and wane that's really important to us, but there's these other factors like mobility, urbanization, issues of unaddressed poverty or education. And then sometimes we go in the wrong direction looking for the solutions, which I feel like is happening right now, but I don't think it's appropriate to go into that. I don't know. I think I beat around the bush on that one.
No, it's so helpful. Actually, to give a cap for a future episode, though, what would you want to flesh out more on that one?
If I were to do,
if you were to flesh that out more for a future one.
Oh, for a future podcast?
Yeah. Because that is something that people wrestle with is, man, I feel I'm trying to do the right thing. And how do I redeem the lost time somehow? And there's a lot of people right now trying to figure out this post-COVID thing and navigating that as well.
Yeah, I'm afraid you just gave me a kaleidoscope of thoughts with what you just said, because I think about the book, Ideas Have Consequences.
Yeah.
So we need to think about the ideas we have. Sometimes when I hear things from the politicians, left, right, and center, it's like, do you realize what the consequence of that is? How far down the road are you looking? And Americans are famous or infamous for being short-sighted. So that's one area, consequences of our ideas. The other is meaning and fulfillment. Does Viktor Frankl still have something to say to us today with his logotherapy, Man's Search for Meaning? Or how about Erich Fromm and his little book on love, which reflects a lot of what I would call Christian ideas about agape or unconditional love. And so there's some ideas, truth, goodness, beauty. There's some subjects that people really need to think more about. Take the word liberty, freedom, or equality. What do we mean? Everybody probably knows the triangle that the French had, liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? So is that an isosceles triangle? Is it shaped, is it peaked this way, or is it, longer this way? Is the base shorter, or is it longer than the sides? Which is to say, so is this an equilateral triangle? So fraternity, liberty, what was the other said?
Love?
No. So the French triangle then,
Truth?
liberty, freedom. It's getting late here, isn't it? Fraternity is a brotherhood. And so, okay, but how does that match with equality? Are those sides of the triangle going to be the same length, or is one going to be longer than the other? What happens when they're stretched to one or the other? Liberty, equality, and fraternity, the trio. Liberty, equality. Okay, what about equality? Well, the French have talked about that. They've championed that. We will talk about the French Revolution and the rolling of heads, a bloody solution, not a successful solution. But now France has many people who are the children, adult children of former guest workers who want to stay in the country and they want to be citizens. But as I recall, just because you're born in France doesn't make you a citizen of France, unlike if you're born in America. Currently, the law says that you are an American citizen. So I hope I have that right. Like I said, I'm a storyteller right now. I'm not researching. That's my caveat. So you have people who are saying, well, where's justice for us? Where's fraternity for us? Where's equality for us? And so culture changes. And the size of these triangles may get stretched this way or that way. And we have to be honest that, hey, we may not be living up to, well, for example, as Americans, up to our own Constitution, our own ideals. And what should we do about that? Well, if we're really comfortable, we probably don't care about doing much about it, or just give it lip service. But when we get uncomfortable, then maybe we're moved to do something about it.
As we wrap up, I just had a thought of when you're mentioning symposiums and papers. So is this something where everyone presents the papers and then everyone who is there and attends is off, they speak and present a paper, or just submit a paper? And then is everyone required to read everyone's papers, that kind of thing?
The way we did it is all papers had to be submitted early enough, both those in English and those in Russian, to be translated. And then the papers were made available. I don't remember how much earlier, it had to be at least a week, but made available to the presenters so they could read ahead what other people were saying and try to digest it. So we have the round table, 25 presenters, and over a course of, I forget, maybe 4 days, sometimes 5 days, these 25 papers would be presented. So it was punctuated, with breakfast, lunch, and supper, and then some outing in the evening. So it wasn't quite like in the conferences, like, when it's over, it's like, wow, that was a lot. Whereas this was measured out. And so each person then had their assigned, according to the program, their assigned time that they were to present their paper. And so everybody was at the table, and we could have up to 25 spectators behind us. But that would include the translators probably. And a person would have 20 minutes to present his paper. The Americans would have 40 minutes because with an interpreter, it's going to take you twice as long. And then everyone had 20 minutes after that for a Q&A. So you presented your paper, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, and then the chairman called for a Q&A and watched the clock for 20 minutes and tried to move people along that were using the occasion to give their own ideas or lecture. They're supposed to, we always would joke about this, supposed to ask a question, but they would say, I have a question and a comment. And quite often the comment was more important than the question. They were just kind of showing off their knowledge. So, but we worked around it and it became kind of humorous. So papers beforehand in your own language, you present the paper. Everybody around the table then has the opportunity to ask you questions for clarification. First of all, clarification. Comments if there was time at the end, but it wasn't, it was, the questions should be questions that clarified. And it might clarify that this paper didn't go far enough, or, by the question, without actually being critical of the paper. What do you say about this? It's not in your paper, but it seems to be germane. So, and everybody knowing that their papers were also going to be responded to, that would make them think twice too about being Moorish or highly critical. But remember, these are academics, academic papers, professionals, and we must be used to being critical in the sense of critiquing, not in the sense of trying to destroy.
What was the ultimate end goal?
That's a good question, because I would be asked that, and they had the idea that there should be some conclusion at the end, and then when we put this in the paper as a recommendation or something. That happened on occasion, but I tended to avoid that. The goal was set out in the purpose, basically to understand each other, to communicate with each other, to see if each other's ideas may lead to a changing of our own ideas. And in turn then to take this exchange back into the classroom with us, any kind of a sensitivity or sense of moral values that maybe was weak before that should be there. Greater appreciation for the Christians in the classroom, realizing that, hey, there are Christians that they present better papers than we do. First, close to 10 years, their papers were pretty bad compared to the Western papers because they weren't used to being judged or critiqued. And lots of time there's a lot of flowery language. Even the translators from Russian into English would come to me and say, George, this is all fluff. I'll tell you what all these words are, but I can't make it into a sentence that will mean anything to your American or English readers.
Wow.
So it was pretty bad. And Janowski that started with me, he felt the same way about their papers. This is embarrassing. So they got better after a while when things began to change. But the changed thinking at that table that then they would take back to their classroom or to their medical practice or whatever the profession was the primary objective.
So it has a major culture impact on influencers.
It was a changed thinking that would change attitudes, that would change behavior.
Yeah, that's neat. Thank you for explaining that. Would you like to wrap up in prayer?
Father in heaven, it's amazing the things that you may do that surprise us, not surprised that you can do these things, but that you would use us to do these things. I'm thankful that this tiger by the tail turned out to be such a blessing to so many people from so many places and continues so. Thank you for all of our students, all of our translators, all the attendees, everybody who had a part in this. And Father, if there are those that are among this group that are in need of encouragement, may you encourage them. If they're in need of financial help, may you help them financially. If they have family or health problems, Father, just looking back at the team that was involved in all of this and how you used them, please bless them, because I know a lot of people are hurting in many different ways, and we lost one of our key staff members and translators. And Katya died of COVID complications. It's a tough world, Father. We're thankful that you are with us. May you bless others as you blessed this group